All right, hello, welcome back. So we're on the very last little bit of chapter 3 here on the cultural matrix of inquiry. The last section 6. So let's get into it. So Dewey writes that we are thus brought back to the original problem, our original problem, namely, he says, transformation of animal activities into intelligent behavior, having the properties which, when formulated, are logical in nature. So we're getting back to this basic problem of how animal behavior becomes intelligent and then logical behavior, or behavior having logical properties. He goes on, associated behavior is characteristic not only of plants and animals, but of electrons, atoms, and molecules, as far as we know of everything that exists in nature. So things react to each other, they interact with certain other things, whether it's by a kind of habit or instinct, or because of the inherent chemical properties of a thing, or the basic physical properties that will attract it to some things and not to other things, to cause it to become associated with other things. So associated behavior is characteristic of everything that we know of. And then he goes on about language. So language did not originate association, but when it supervened as a natural emergence from previous forms of animal activity, it reacted to transform prior forms and modes of associated behavior in such a way as to give experience a new dimension. All right, so a couple of things here maybe. So, right, association did not originate with language. You have various kinds of association previous to language. But when language came into being, when it got involved, Dewey uses the word supervened. This is not the kind of modern sense of supervened when people in the early 20th century used the word supervene. I forget the the exact definition, but it's kind of like to get involved in something, kind of like intervene, right? But when language supervened, when it came into the picture as it came in as a natural emergence from previous forms of animal activity, so it's continuous with animal activity, even though it's its own distinct thing. It builds on, we might say, previous forms of activity, non-linguistic forms of activity. The language then reacted to transform previous behavior and gave that behavior a new, what he says is a new dimension. We'll kind of see what that is later, but made it intelligent in a way, gave us the ability to have foresight, to discuss the nature of things instead of just responding in a kind of habitual way or instinctive way. But let's go on to kind of the sub points here. So number 1, culture and all that culture involves as distinguished from nature is both a condition and a product of language. Right? So it's so culture is one of the conditions for the existence of language, having a certain kind of culture, since language doesn't come from nowhere. And I would say even like many kinds of animals have culture of a certain sense in that they learn and transmit certain kinds of behaviors. It's not all, at least for many animals, not everything can be accounted for by just kind of hardwiring or genetic encoding. But in any case, culture is a condition for language, but also a product of language, right? Once language gets started, that's really the main way by which we transmit culture. So he goes on, since language is the only means of retaining and transmitting to subsequent generations acquired skills, acquired information, and acquired habits, it is the latter, which means to say that culture is a product of language to the extent that language is the only means of all of that, retaining, transmitting to subsequent generations acquired skills and information and habits. I don't think this is probably strictly true anymore. Animal studies are in a better state now than they were when Dewey was writing. So I think animals, as I said just a moment ago, there are ways of, it seems, of transmitting acquired skills without language in a broad sense, although this gets tricky too. You can look at certain kinds of animal communication, and maybe in like a very broad sense we would consider that a language. So maybe he's not wrong here. I don't know. It's a kind of a gray area. We don't need to get into all the arguments and debates and ins and outs of that. But in any case, language is definitely a very, very important thing for retaining and transmitting acquired skills, information, and habits. Last sentence here. Since, however, meanings and the significance of events differ in different cultural groups, it is also the former, right? So the culture of different cultural groups is one of the conditions of their particular language. Languages differ, cultures differ. Language is a part of culture. Culture is a product of, there's a kind of circular relation, right? But cultures are, of course, different. And so it makes sense that those differences matter for the language. Number 2, animal activities, such as eating and drinking, searching for food, copulation, etc., acquire new properties. Acquire new properties under the emergence of language. Eating food becomes a group festival and celebration. Procuring food, the art of agriculture and exchange. Copulation passes into the institution of the family. Well, this is maybe a little bit Victorian here, but yes, we could say more about the varieties of copulation that have emerged since human beings evolved language, but we won't get into that here. But the point being that all these so-called animal activities acquire new properties once you get human societies based around language use. Going on anyway to number 3 as quickly as possible. Number 3, apart from the existence of symbol meanings, the results of prior experience are retained only through strictly organic modifications. The idea here being that when an animal interacts with the world, its organism is changed, its body is changed. It changes as a result of the interactions, which will make it more or less likely to do certain things again in the future. So this is how things work without symbol meanings, without symbols, which we can use to kind of hold on and transmit behaviors and consequences and things like that. So retained only through strictly organic modifications. Moreover, these modifications, once made, tend to become so fixed as to retard, if not to prevent, the occurrence of further modifications. So habits, once they develop, are hard to change, right? It makes it difficult maybe to acquire vastly new habits, to acquire vastly new kinds of behaviors once a habit kind of sets in. The existence of symbols makes possible deliberate recollection and expectation, and thereby the institution of new combinations of selected elements of experiences having an intellectual dimension. So symbols make it possible for us to deliberately recall stuff from the past, discuss things that happened in the past think about and discuss what might happen in the future, make plans regarding that, think about contingencies, recombine things using words. And this is what is characteristic of the intellectual dimension. What Dewey calls the intellectual dimension, as opposed to just animalistic habit. Going on to number 4. Organic biological activities end in overt actions, whose consequences are irretrievable, right? Once you do something, once you do an overt action, that can't be undone, right? An overt action is an overt action. Overt action having a consequence in the real world, that consequence happens, it's past, right? You can't go back and undo that. I mean, in a practical sense, you can, if you tip over something, you can put it back up, but the original consequence is still there. You can't undo that first tipping over of whatever. When an activity, he writes, when an activity and its consequences can be rehearsed by representation in symbolic terms, there is no such final commitment, right? So you can think about what would happen if I did this, what would happen if I did that, and there's no undoable consequence there, right? It's once you actually do the thing, then the consequence is irretrievable, as he says. If the representation of the final consequence is of unwelcome quality, overt activity may be foregone, or the way of acting be replanned in such a way as to avoid the undesired outcome. Of course, when you actually do the thing, you might get the undesired outcome anyway, but at least you can, through foresight, through planning, through manipulation of symbols, representations, you can get a sense of what is likely to happen if I do this rather than that. What do I like about this consequence? What do I want to avoid with this consequence? And then you're more likely, at least, to get the consequence you want. Of course, real life doesn't always work out perfectly, but that's beside the point at the moment. There's an important footnote here. I'm not going to try to put it on the screen. It's in a different file. Of course, if you have the book, it's conveniently at the bottom of the page. But I do want to read this one. It's a little, it's maybe more interesting than some of his other footnotes, or more relevant. So footnote 7 says, generalizing beyond the strict requirements of the position outlined. So this is not something that's necessarily entailed by the position that he's giving in this book, but it's a further generalization, a further conclusion you could draw. He says, I would say that I am not aware of any so-called merely mental activity or result that cannot be described in the objective terms of an organic activity modified and directed by symbols, meaning, or language in its broad sense. There's a point about mental. What is the meaning of mental? Which he's making, and this is maybe a little bit related to behaviorism, which was pretty well established by this point. Actually, Dewey's Logic was published the same year as B.F. Skinner's first book, which was something like The Behavior of Organisms. I think that was also 1938. Dewey's not quite a behaviorist in Skinner's sense, although they're fairly close. Yeah, we don't need to get into a full-fledged comparison at this moment, but he's basically saying that you can think of the mental, that there's not really anything more to the mental than organic activity modified and directed by symbols, meaning. So organic activity, bodily activity, modified through the use of symbols is what we mean by when we talk about mental. Does it mean anything else? Well, people can argue about that, but Dewey's pointing out that when we say mental, there's maybe nothing else that we mean by it. But let's go on. So these transformations and others which they suggest, so all those various transformations that take place when human animals begin to use symbols, these transformations and others which they suggest are not of themselves equivalent to accrual of logical properties to behavior. So this is not logic itself yet. But they provide the requisite condition for it. The use of deliberation as a rehearsal through such symbols of the activities by which the ends may be brought into being is at least a rudimentary form of reasoning in connection with solution of problems. So when we deliberate and rehearse what we might do, the different options that we have for attaining a certain end, we're getting into the realm of reasoning, which earlier, if you recall from many pages back, was something like matching of ends and means, finding the right ends for the right finding the right means for the right ends, rather. Choosing the most likely to be effective means to achieve the desired end. So going on, the habit of reasoning. I think we're down here, by the way. The habit of reasoning, once instituted, is capable of indefinite development on its own account. The ordered development of meanings in their relations to one another may become an engrossing interest. So we may get really, really interested in just developing meanings, relating meanings to each other through manipulation of symbols, irrespective of whether we're putting anything into action, right? It's kind of like coming up with ideas just for the sake of coming up with ideas. We may not intend to do anything with those ideas, but there is something in human behavior that tends to an overproduction of ideas, which I think is good. It's kind of an evolutionary thing if you think about it, right? One of the things that makes evolution possible is that there's more stuff than you need, and kind of the less good stuff, the less effective stuff, the less adaptable stuff gets weeded out or filtered out of the process, and you're left with hopefully the better, more effective ideas or behaviors or adaptations or whatever. But you need that overproduction for any kind of filtering process to take place. Where are we? The order of development meanings. Yeah, maybe that may become an engrossing interest. When this happens, implicit logical conditions are made explicit, and then logical theory of some sort is born. So you're figuring out why, kind of making rules about how to relate symbols to each other, irrespective, again, of practical action. It may be imperfect. This logical theory that is born may be imperfect. It will be imperfect from the standpoint of the inquiries and symbol meanings that later develop, because there's generally progress in the development of logic. But the first step, the one that costs and counts, was taken when someone began to reflect upon language, upon logos, in its syntactical structure and its wealth of meaning contents. So reflecting on how language is put together, on how the various contents of language relate to each other, that's the crucial first step in developing logic. Let's go down here. So hypostatization of logos was the first result, kind of turning logos into a substance, into a thing, into a kind of a real kind of effect-having sort of thing. Hypostatization of logos was the first result, and it held back for centuries the development of inquiries of a kind that are competent to deal with the problems of the existent world. But the hypostatization was, nevertheless, a tribute to the power of language to generate reasoning, and through application of the meanings contained in it, to confer fuller and more ordered significance upon existence. Yeah, so there's minor points here. I think Dewey will address a little bit in the following paragraphs the Greeks, who were maybe the first that we really know about in any detail to hypostatize language, to develop this idea that concepts are out there as some fundamental part of the universe. Yeah, I don't want to dwell on this latter sentence too much. Of course, all these points will be returned to more fully later in the book. Let's go on to the next paragraph here. So in later chapters, we shall consider in some detail how a logic of ordered discourse, a logic that gathered in a system the relations which hold meanings consistently together in discourse, was taken to be the final model of logic, and thereby obstructed the development of effective modes of inquiry into existence, preventing the necessary reconstruction and expansion of the very meanings that were used in discourse. That sentence is probably too long. If I were Dewey's editor, I might have suggested he break that down a bit. But the main point is that when you get this idea of, or when you start to look at language as something autonomous, that can be, you look at it as a kind of syntactic structure, a structure of meanings, that can become your model of logic, right? We've talked before about this autonomous idea of logic as logic of something separate, which you then apply extrinsically to the matter of experience. But in Dewey's view, that kind of retards progress, that prevents these meanings from being reconstructed, from logical ideas being reconstructed to be more effective when they are applied to existential subject matter. So let's go on. So for when these meanings in their ordered relations to one another were taken to be final in and of themselves, they were directly superimposed upon nature. So nature was thought to have this logical structure that you find in language, or that people came to find in language, kind of invent in language. Once that was established, we thought then nature must be like that, must be logos. The necessity of existential operations for application of meanings to nature was ignored, right? Remember, meanings only come into being through social interaction, through trying to get desired consequences in nature through social coordination and so on. But you start to ignore all of that once you have this idea of an autonomous logos. This failure reacted into the system of meanings as meanings. It had an effect on meanings. The result was the belief that the requirement of rational discourse constitute the measure of natural existence, the criterion of complete being. Let me read that again. The result of this development of making language autonomous was the belief that the requirements of rational discourse constitute the measure of natural existence. So natural existence must be like a language. It is true, do I have that up? Let's see here. So last sentence here. It is true that logic emerged as the Greeks became aware of language as logos, with the attendant implication that a system of ordered meanings is involved. So logic, the development of logic is bound up in this development of language, what we thought language was, how we understood language, and how we understood language in nature in relation to nature, in relation to existence. And there were some problems because of that. So second paragraph, so again, he's talking about the Greeks becoming aware of language as logos, as kind of this autonomous structure, maybe eternal formal structure of meaning. And this perception marked, he says, an enormous advance, but it suffered from two serious defects. So it suffered from defects. Two of them, which Dewey will tell us. The first one, because of the superior status assigned to forms of rational discourse, they were isolated from the operations by means of which meanings originate, function, and are tested. So the forms of rational discourse, the logical forms, were isolated, because they were thought to be superior, they were isolated from the practical actions that originate meanings in the first place and that give them their function and by which they are tested, right? Ideas are tested through practical action, coordinated action. Going on, this isolation was equivalent to the hypostatization of reason. That's the first problem, is the separation from of meanings from the means of the origination and testing of meaning. In the second place, the meanings that were recognized were ordered in a gradation derived from and controlled by a class structure of Greek society. So the hierarchy of meaning was actually controlled by social hierarchy, not by something innate in meanings themselves, in symbolism itself, in language itself, but through social hierarchy. And he goes on. Let me get that more centered on the screen. He writes, "The means, procedures, and kinds of organization that arose from active or practical participation in natural processes were given low rank in the hierarchy of being and knowing." So kind of the blue-collar, the means and procedures and organizations that arose from what we might call blue-collar work were given low rank in this hierarchy, kind of the metaphysical, logical hierarchy. The scheme of knowledge and of nature became, without conscious intent, a mirror of a social order in which craftsmen, mechanics, artisans generally held a low position in comparison with a leisure class. Citizens as citizens were also occupied with doing, a doing instigated by need or lack. I think we're talking about the leisure class here, the citizens, landowners, I think. I've forgotten my knowledge of ancient Greece, or much of it at this point. I should review that sometime. While possessed of a freedom denied to the artisan class, they were also taken to fail. So I guess the people involved in governing, not the leisure class, but the people involved in governing, the citizens, right, were the governing class. Well, we can look it up later. So they were also taken to fail in completely self-contained and self-sufficient activity. So they did not have appropriately self-sufficient activity. The latter was exemplified only in the exercise of pure reason, untainted by need for anything outside itself, and hence independent of all operations of doing and making. So self-contained, self-sufficient activity was of the true leisure class, people who don't need to make anything, who have no aims outside of themselves, or at least they can kind of pretend more easily that they don't have any function outside of themselves. The historic result was to give philosophic, even supposedly ontological sanction to the cultural conditions which prevented the utilization of the immense potentialities for attainment of knowledge that were resident in the activities of the arts. So philosophers tended to not acknowledge or maybe separate themselves off through their own concepts, kind of use their own kind of assumptions and predilections to cut themselves off from the actual kinds of activities that would realize and produce those concepts and allow them to be reconstructed when they are maybe no longer well functioning. So it gave philosophic, even ontological sanction to the cultural conditions preventing using the potentialities for knowledge in the arts, in the practical arts, that were resident in the activities of the arts, resident in them because, going on here, so resident in them because they involve operations of active modification of existing conditions, which contain the procedures constituting the experimental method, when once they are employed for the sake of obtaining knowledge, instead of being subordinated to a scheme of uses and enjoyments controlled by given socio-cultural conditions. So it's actually the activities of the arts, practical activities, that contain the seeds of the experimental method. Once you start using these to engage in knowing as such, and kind of revising, reconstructing what we know, rather than, as he says, being subordinated to sociocultural conditions. So rather than just trying to make something that is more and more pleasing to a customer, you're using these same kinds of techniques to produce a better and better knowledge, a more and more useful knowledge of the world. All right, and we have completed chapter 3. So in the next time, we're going to go on to chapter 4, which is also a really, really good and important chapter about the relation and distinction between, as you can see here, common sense and scientific inquiry. So this is a really important topic. But that will be next. All right, see you later.